Greet your neighbors. Our reflection today will be authored by John Scott.
As we pause this afternoon, please hear the words that I say and interpret them within your own beliefs and understanding. Eternal Father, we're thankful for the glorious fall day that you've laid before us, for the sun and the cool breeze that remind us that the season has changed. We thank you especially for the family gatherings and reunions happening this week. May they be happy and safe. This afternoon, we thank you for the hands that have skillfully prepared a meal for us, for our nourishment, and for the fellowship we enjoy as members of the Rotary Club of Wooster, Ohio. As Rotarians, we especially know that one of our major areas of focus and one of our perpetual goals is the supporting efforts that prevent and treat disease, illness, and disability. As audacious as this goal may sometimes seem to be, we're blessed to have your strength behind us in our efforts. You give us the muscle and persistence in dedicating ourselves to the care and healing of others. We pray that those in areas of the world that are closed off to care, such as inoculation and education, will respond to your will and submit to our help. As we make progress, please help all Rotarians to persevere in their quest to improve the health of others, both home and abroad. We thank you and pray for the health and safety of our children. We ask that you give wisdom and skill to those in the medical profession that dedicate their lives to improving their health and by eliminating disease and teaching healthy habits. Be with us as Rotarians as we strive to support causes that focus on improving lives of those generations following our own. And finally, Father, we ask that you continue to protect those that suffer with ailments in body, mind, and spirit. Give us all the will to sacrifice whatever is necessary of us in time, talent, and treasures to care for the sick, to comfort those who are mourning, and to give courage to the oppressed, and to foster will among all. In your name we pray.
Thank you, John. I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but this weekend was a great Al Valley tournament with a nail biter at the very end. And I would also like to make an appeal to any of you who have hosted a youth exchange student. I have videos from our inbounds and from our outbounds, but none of those who have hosted. And this is what makes our program so successful. If you'd be willing to do a short 2 or 3 minute video, please see me after the meeting. I can bring my laptop to you and make it very easy because I've mastered it after some attempts. The expiration date on our contract is December with the Australian company that does these. So it runs out in December. And lastly, I think it bears repeating that many of you will get a solicitation from district about donating to every Rotarian every year. I would urge you to consider waiting for our local effort through every Rotarian every year. Chris Pycraft will begin that campaign after the beginning of the year. I have a short video from Vince Mariola.
Hello, my name is Vince Mariola, and I was a Rotary Youth Exchange student in Saint-Étienne, France in 1998. I had just finished high school here in the States, and went abroad for 1 year. I attended high school in Saint Etienne, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. If anybody's watching this video and is considering doing Rotary Youth Exchange program, I would highly, highly recommend it. It was a wonderful year, and it changed the trajectory of my life completely. It changed the way I view the world, and all my decisions after that were impacted by my year abroad. The way I decided what school I was going to go to and what life decisions I was going to make. To this day, I love international travel. I love learning about the world. I love understanding how complex the world is, and I attribute that to my year abroad. So anyone considering it, it's a wonderful program, and you should, if you have the opportunity to do it, you should do it. Thanks.
We have President Lynn and the President and the Secretary's report.
Boy, thank you. Don't want that promotion again. Scott Allen has the traveling microphone, and we'll start over on the right with Dean Vidia.
I have two guests. My first guest is Dr. Charlie Brown, retired Charlie Duration Ham. A former colleague of Tony Tizzano, and Dr. Dave Reynolds, the former internist and also retired now.
At the same table, Susan Marlar.
My guest is not a doctor, sorry. Glenn Beck joined me more a few weeks ago.
And we get to hear from Mama, our exchange student, and look forward to hearing from you next week and hearing how you like turkey.
Hello everyone, I'm and I'm so happy and excited for this week because it's Thanksgiving and in my country I don't have a Thanksgiving. And the last weekend, me and the other exchange students, we went to the show of Charlie. It's so nice because Akshara was in the cast the show. I'm so excited for Thanksgiving. Thank you.
We have two announcements from the podium, from Courtney Yoder and Donna Connolly. And while they're coming up, just like a couple announcements, it's the final call on the turkey. And remember, turkey is just kind of a euphemism for any donation you'd like to give to people to people. There are forms up here if you would like those, or you can just make a checkout and just make sure you note on there that it is for the Al Van Wee tournament or the Al Van Wee event. Members who left the club, we often have people ask, I didn't know so-and-so left. So after every board meeting, which was last Wednesday, I will try to update you on new members or members we have lost. And we did lose 3 members this past month, all because of either job changes or relocation. And it's Brianna Kreitz, who used to sit over in this area. Tyler Corbus used to sit almost where Bob Gorman is right there. And Joe Zecker, of course, the leader of People to People, who was always over here on the right-hand side. So we'll try to keep you updated on those. And one final announcement, 2 weeks from today, Monday, December 8th, we will have the flag groups. We will present the checks to them. So it'd be great to have a good turnout to support those. We will start the meeting at noon. So if you'd like to get here a little early for lunch, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
I just wanted to give you a quick update on the Al Van Wee tournament. So we did have our clinic on the 16th. We had about 70-ish kids come to that, which was about double of what we had before last year. So that was a really good turnout. The kids were great. The college basketball players were awesome. So it was an amazing time. And then this past weekend, we had the tournament. So if you've never been to it, it's actually a lot of fun. And this year it wasn't a true tournament. They kind of just played different teams. So normally, if it's a tournament, you don't know if College of Worcester is going to be in it on Saturday, but this year they were for sure. So it was kind of nice. So we had a 50-50 held Friday and Saturday night, and then we had raffle basket. So we had like a Worcester basket, which was like valued over $1,400. And then we had a Top Golf basket, and then we had a certified Angus beef basket. So we had, between that, we were able to raise almost $500 that we can donate back to people to people. And then if you don't know, also with the Albion League tournament, in order, just for this weekend, they will, to get into the tournament, you can bring 2 cans of food and get into the tournament for free. So for both nights, we, and the clinic, we had about 24 boxes of food that we were able to donate back to people. Then with the schools, we have a food drive, which is also part of this whole Albion League thing. If you don't know how this all works, we have a food drive that's going on. So we had Worcester City Schools participate, Tri-Way Schools participate, Waynesville participate, and St. Mary's. Between all 4 of them, we're close to about 10,000 cans of items of food that we were able to donate back to the people. So it was, I would say, a pretty successful year, definitely up from last year. So hopefully we can continue to get more schools to participate. Worcester City did win, just if you want to know. Worcester City did raise the most food, so we did acknowledge them at the tournament this past weekend. So we had a certificate that we had given them, and the College of Worcester actually gives them College of Worcester basketball that they can take back to the school and use however they would like. So like President Allen said, if you did miss the game, it was a phenomenal game on Saturday. It came down to College of Worcester winning by just literally 1 point. So it was a phenomenal game. If you missed it, I'm sorry. So you'll have to come back next year and watch. So, or just catch them another game. I guess they have it's just the beginning of the season. So come watch them. They're definitely a good team to watch. So that's all I have for you.
Okay, so I wanted to talk to you about our exchange program. We had 2 wonderful students this year. You just heard from Mamo, and Akshara is off with her host family on a Thanksgiving trip to Michigan. If you haven't gotten to know them, I encourage you to sit at the table with them at lunch and chat with them because they're both delightful. Now I'm here to ask for your help. I know a lot of you have hosted students in the past, some recently and some longer ago when your kids were younger. And we really need host families for the rest of this academic year and for the years coming up. And I'm not expecting you to volunteer to host, although I'd love it if you would. But what I'm asking you to do is to reach out to your friends and your neighbors, try to identify possible host families, and then share their contact information with me or with Brian Rice. Because we really need to get more families. And I just think our exchange program is one of the most important programs that Rotary does. I think the path to global peace and international understanding, it's paved by one person and one family at a time. And I think that our exchange program does that. So please help us find some families. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donna and Courtney. Welcome to our guests. We hope you enjoyed today's program in the Fellowship of Wooster Rotary. We hope to see you again at future meetings. So here is Doug Druschel, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, President Allen. With a name like Anthony Tizzano, you won't be surprised that our speaker grew up in an Italian neighborhood on the east side of Cleveland, from which he went to Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania, received his bachelor's degree there, summa cum laude, got his medical degree at Ohio State, residency at Bethesda Hospital in Cincinnati, and he's had a career in obstetrics and gynecology, and he's a fellow in that field. He's presently the director of student and learner health at the Cleveland Clinic, and is a clinical professor of surgery also. He's also a frequent public speaker, and he has what can only be considered an amazing collection of old medical stuff. And I was privileged to tour that not too long ago. I said, hey, would you be willing to talk about that to Wooster Rotary? He said, sure, I'll be happy to talk about that. So please welcome to the Wooster podium, Dr. Tony Tizzano.
Well, Doug, thanks for that kind introduction. I like the thing that you have a reflection. And, you know, I had to do a little digging to see what was Rotary all about. But actually, when I first came to Worcester, I was at a board meeting. I quickly got involved with Every Woman's House Now 180. And Bobby Douglas told us that we have a young lady en route from Japan and in the air, but her host family had fallen through. Is there anyone who thinks they can pinch hit for a while? And I thought, gee, that sounds interesting. Now, my kids were all in elementary school early. So I went home, and of course, you always have to couch this conversation. I go, honey, what do you think about an exchange student someday? She goes, well, that would be kind of fun. I go, can we do tomorrow? And so we had Kaori. Kaori came and spent 6 months with us. It was a fabulous experience. It came with a little note from her parents that said 4 Ds: no drinking, no dating, no driving, no drugs. And so with that, having all small children, I have this high school student. And of course, I didn't know anyone in the high school. And she, of course, wanted to socialize with all these high school students. And I always felt obligated to have some sense of who they were. So the poor principal at the high school, so what's the deal with so-and-so or such and such? Can we do an overnight? Yes, yes, yes. But it was a fabulous experience. So it centers around something, though, that I think was mentioned as you look at having students coming in the future. This is about mentorship. And you can't replace mentorship. And you can't replace wisdom, but wisdom takes a long time to get. So I look at this room, I look at the people I know, and there's a tremendous amount of wisdom. And if there was a wisdom tree that I could sit under and shake, I would do it. But it's an opportunity to share a mentorship with these young people, and it's so critical. And I have to mention my great pleasure in seeing Charlie Brown here, who was my chairman when I came to Worcester. And there's no doubt that it was his mentorship and his willingness to embrace a difference, my wanting to do other things besides just practice medicine, to lecture all over God's creation. And he really said, oh, you got to do it. Much to the chagrin probably of some of my other partners, but it was really his support that allowed me to do this, and in part built this collection. So to kill or cure, the evolution of medicine in the 19th century. And this is a potpourri. I don't want to tell you how many slides because I'm going to go through them quickly. I want you to look at them as much from an artistic standpoint as where technology was. So my objectives really are to appreciate the challenges that were faced by 19th century physicians when we had no medicines. We had ideas of surgery, but we weren't washing our hands. We had lots of things to consider. To become acquainted with some extraordinary instruments made from materials that we don't use today because they didn't worry about sterilization. And to really appreciate the ingenuity of these 19th century practitioners as they tried to fix things that they really barely understood. So if we go back a little further, most of what we did in medicine came from Europe. And this whole idea of medical colleges was a 16th century iteration, but it was really divinity. So in this image, you see the pomegranate for fertility. You see taking the pulse, but the hand is reaching down from the heavens. And that's more or less the way we thought about it. If you look at Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a great Harvard physician in the 19th century, he said, there is nothing that men will not do. There is nothing that they will not have done to recover their health and save their lives. They have submitted to being seared with hot irons like galley slaves, to have needles thrust into their flesh and fires kindled on their skin, to swallow all sorts of abominations, and to pay for all of this as if to be singed, scalded, or a costly privilege, as if blisters were a blessing and leeches a luxury. I look at what you do as the Rotary in promoting health internationally. And our motto in medicine, first do no harm, from Hippocrates. But he also said, what cannot be cured by medicines is cured by the knife. What cannot be cured by the knife is cured by fire. And what fire cannot cure is incurable. So we have a rather interesting history. Success required a number of things. We had to have education. And when you look at this country at the time of the revolution, there was very little medical education, and most physicians were clergy, self-appointed physicians. This is actually an image from Worcester, when the college, which is now Case Western Reserve, had its medical school in Worcester and did the dissections here because it was drawing so much bad attention in Cleveland. So this is Dr. Augustin Weber, which was a famous surgeon in Cleveland, at a table with a cadaver doing anatomy dissection. We needed exposure. You had to be able to see what you were doing. And this is a well-lit room. But remember, surgery began before incandescent lighting. So it had to be an east-facing window in the morning so you could see what you were trying to do. It was nice if you got into bleeding that you could stop it, but we did not have suture materials or clamps, which did that well. So lots of things like cautery were used, literally singe the blood vessel to stop it. It's always helpful if when you're operating, the patient's not wiggling, but anesthesia didn't come to the middle of the 19th century, 1846 in Boston. And finally, it took us a long time to wash our hands. And I think Charlie will tell you, if there was a thing that happened in our career which changed hand washing, it was H1N1 flu. When all of a sudden, every screensaver on every computer in the Cleveland Clinic said, did you wash your hands? Did you wash your hands? But it used to be that you kind of normalized deviance, maybe washed your hands a little bit, not very long. But we did this in earnest with H1N1. And what did we have? We had one of the lowest prevalences of flu in the history of flu in the United States because we were all afraid of it. And that was my daughter's first year in college, and had 2 class members die from H1N1. That wakes you up as a parent for a college student. So to learn anatomy, using cadavers was not easy. They weren't preserved well. So models were prepared, fabulous models made of wax, but their longevity was a question. This is an anatomical model showing all the facial nerves. This was probably one of my greatest coups. This is a Ozu model, a life-size man with about 96 pieces and over 2,000 identified structures that was developed in the early 19th century by a gentleman who said, we can't look at cadavers, so I have to create models that we could take apart and teach anatomy. Cross-sectional slides. This is from the Starling Medical College at Ohio State in the early 19th century, where they took cross-sections of babies that had died and stained them to look at cross-sectional anatomy, because there was no X-ray, there was no MRI, there was no ultrasound or CAT scans. So this proximity of one structure to another was either dissection, but here you could illuminate these slides and project them on a wall. Models were made, this one in the case of a pelvis, to show how childbirth could be obstructed, cast of bronze. This is an ophthalmal phantom, where you mount cow or pig eyes into a face and learn how to use an ophthalmoscope so that you could examine the backside of the eye. Of course, education still in medicine, even today, is predicated entirely on our literature. But at the time of the early 19th century, there was very little in the way of literature. But that was changed in large part because of the Civil War. At the time of the Civil War, sorry, I slipped. What did I do there? How do I go backwards? No, sorry, apologize. At the time of the Civil War, there was a very small amount, but as the century went on and medical schools exploded, in Cincinnati, at the time of the Civil War, there were 13 medical schools, where there's only 1 now. And this was because of its proximity to the front. But from that came all kinds of information. And pretty soon, as we got to the mid-19th century, 250 some journals had been published, and over half of the world's literature was coming out of the United States. If you look at colonial practitioners, very few had any formal training. And in colonial Williamsburg, only 10 could claim any degree whatsoever in medicine. Again, these were mostly quacks. And written by Smith in his History of New York, quacks abound like locusts in Egypt. We have no law to protect the king's subjects from the malpractice of pretenders. Any man at his pleasure sets up for physician, apothecary, and surgeon. Early medical training was a product of Edinburgh, where you had, if you could afford it, go to Europe and get some decent formal training. But this was usually not the case. And this is a small dissecting set that came from a student in Edinburgh. Osler, who was probably one of the greatest early American physicians, who said, you have to read, you have to study to be able to practice this craft. And you have to learn on patients. To study the phenomenon of disease without books is to sail an uncharted sea, while to study books without patients is not to go to sea at all. The residency system was a real epiphany, and I'm glad to say it actually occurred in obstetrics and gynecology with Withridge Williams. Williams was a protege of Hopkins. He became chairman there, but when he began practice, he had only done 2 deliveries with a patient. To see patients, you had to pay individually for each patient you saw. Clerkships and practice was joining a physician and basically taking care of their household. And if you got to learn some medicine along the way, fine. Well, this changed and changed slowly, but at a time, Hopkins probably produced about 3/4 of the chairs of obstetrics and gynecology in the country. So its influence was unbelievable. But even when I look at my own education and look back at things that were done that I can't almost imagine now, we had no in-house attendants until the last half of my senior year of residency. If we ran into something that had to go to the operating room, we called to let them know we were headed back and to come in to help. And usually we were wheeling the patient out of the operating room by the time they got there. In my 3rd year, I was licensed in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Ohio, and was moonlighting on weekends, the only OBGYN in a hospital in a county. But that's just the way medical education was. But when we got into practice, we were used to doing things on our own. Was that the best way to learn? I think not. Would I have done it differently? Had I been able to? Probably. But that's just the way it was. And that's what we have to do whenever we consider historical aspects of anything, is looking at it through the lens of that time period. Not always easy to do. So medicine was all about inspection. You looked and you diagnosed because you had no tests to really run. And looking at the tongue was really the first kind of inspection. So if it was a purple red tongue, we think of heart disease infection, purple tongue, heart failure, and on and on. You weren't allowed to look at the body, and particularly in some cultures like in the Orient, if a woman of means had an illness or a complaint of one sort or another, she marked it onto this ivory dial, was presented to her physician by the servant without ever seeing the patient, and a prescription of some potion or concoction made. And of course, if there was anything involving the genitalia, and I'm sorry, but I'm a gynecologist, we're going to have to do a little bit of this here and there. You could do it, but you couldn't look. So you had to reach, genuflect and reach underneath the dress to do the pelvic exam. Taking a temperature was an epiphany. We knew that fever and disease went hand in hand, although we really had no understanding. And this was an axillary thermometer made by a company in Cincinnati, Ohio, Woper. It was much more convenient, of course, to be able to have a metallic thermometer that you could just carry in your pocket and didn't have to worry about breaking it. So this particular vitreous thermometer was becoming very popular throughout the 19th century. The pulse was interesting. We knew you had to have a strong pulse, and we knew there could be irregularities, but how did you measure it? And it's hard without seeing this instrument, but this was strapped onto the arm, went over the radial pulse, and gave a little pulse wave with a pen on a piece of paper that moved through a clockwork on the instrument. And of course, we needed to take blood pressure. And we all know today that high blood pressure is a problem. But when they were first measuring blood pressure, they thought that high blood pressure meant the heart worked better. It created greater pressure. That must be good. It took a long time much like tobacco, which we used to give for respiratory ailments, even in the 20th century. And of course, the mercury sphygmomanometer, which we're all familiar with, is now giving way to other devices. The stethoscope was a hallmark in progress in medicine, not only because you could listen to breath sounds and listen to congestion in the chest and later to the heart, but it gave you a way to come close to the patient without hurting them. It used to be when the physician was approaching the patient, there was fear involved because it had a knife or a bloodletting instrument or a cautery iron. So a stethoscope was something that didn't cause pain. And finally, we began to develop a relationship with our patients. Of course, disease was problematic. And the stethoscopes that we had early on were very long. This is about 18 inches long. And that was so that vermin on the patient, lice, what have you, wouldn't jump on to the physician. So we had these very long stethoscopes, and of course sound fell off, and now we have electronic devices that increase the sound of the stethoscope and so on. This is nice because it's from Wooster. I got this from Boyd's Pharmacy. So Boyd's, at one point in time in the late 19th century, had an intact drug manufacturing company in its attic. And it was there when I came to Worcester. Had I only really appreciated getting to know these guys, which actually Charlie had introduced me to, I could have gotten more out of this. And this was in a box being sold as new, where they had just left this at the point in time when they stopped selling products. Percussion hammer, not from the same source, but you all recognize this, getting the knees tapped. We always wanted to quantify and make things as elaborate as possible because that sophistication, that design carried with it some level of importance. And this was a percussion hammer that would drop the weight at just a specific point with a certain intensity so that you could measure how easily you elicited a reflex. No discussion of 19th century medicine and even late 18th century medicine can go on without a discussion of bloodletting. And this is one of the earlier fleams that would be inserted, just forged of iron and inserted usually with the tap of a small stick into a vessel and bloodlet. Bleeding bowls would measure the amount. And this was not just the purview of physicians, but barbers, barber surgeons. And that phrase, kicking the bucket, comes from a barber using a bucket to collect the blood while someone is getting their hair cut in a bowl at the base of the table. If they took too much and they became near fainting, they would say, it looks like he's about to kick the bucket because he was going to stagger away from the chair having that too much blood. More commonly, from the foot, the hands, and the arms were little fleams that were just housed in a tortoiseshell lancet. But these were even more nicely housed in various containers called lancet cases or etuis. This one made of gray skin and polished. This one of tortoiseshell. This one of mother of pearl. This one of ivory inlaid with gold. This one of carved ivory. And this one of silver, which was the most common. But I love this one because it has with it 6 generations of physicians where this was passed from one to another to another. So the importance of bloodletting in our history from George Washington and on is not to be underestimated. And even when I came to Worcester, one of our most senior physicians, Tom Graves, told me that early in his training, they still did bloodletting for polycythemia. When someone's blood count was too high, they just drained a little off. Of course, to make this less painful, you had to do it quickly. So we developed these spring lancets, which could be cut and again housed in a nice little tooled case with chamois lining. And then we had scarificators, which could be used on the back. Now, the back was a great place to let blood because the nerve endings are much further apart on the back. So you could do a lot more cutting with much less pain and then collect volumes of blood using an extractor, not which is heating, but with a syringe. And then later trying to maintain some level of quality in the blood that you took out because it was used for study by having it go directly into a vessel with sharp little needles that could be deployed without actually having to do it and then put the cup over top. And of course, then there's the prize of any collection, that's leech jars. These were wonderful items made from the very late part of the 18th century, all through the Victorian period. And these were kept in pharmacies. They were kept in larger doctors' offices and hospitals, and a supply of leeches ready to go ahead and let blood when you needed to. But more often during surgery, when repairs to blood vessels weren't being done and there was congestion, you would use leeches to relieve that congestion. And we still do that today in plastic surgery, particularly on the face, nose, and what have you, where these veins, which are very difficult to reanastomose, can be disengorged by using leeches, which have a natural anticoagulant. If you were watching the Olympics and you watched Michael Phelps, he had these suction marks on his back. They did dry cupping, where you would create suction and bring blood to the surface by rupturing capillaries, but that was to release this idea of bad humor. If you weren't going to do it that way, you might put the entire leg into a contraption, evacuate the air around it, and make the leg appear hyperemic. And again, bringing that redness to the suture, or to the surface rather, releasing more of the bad humors. We had this notion that pus was a good thing. Not a sign of infection, but a sign of that you were getting rid of something untoward. So by taking a fold of skin and a needle called a seton needle, which had an aperture at its base, you put a piece of cotton or linen, you would prick up a fold of skin, pass the needle through, bring in the cotton, infection would ensue, but it would drain through this piece of fabric, and again, releasing this idea of bad humor, counter irritation. We did it with pricking the skin with a caustic substance causing inflammation with a Lebenswecker, with a specific chemical made in Cleveland, Ohio, and stamped remedy. And then by rolling these pins with this chemical across the skin, again, when you had large areas that were causing you pain or discomfort. And if all else failed, there was burning. So you would take this device, put a little bit of lint, ignite it, and then gently blow with that blowpipe so that you would cause a small blister to raise on the skin, filled with what? Again, bad humor, the cause of disease. Well, if we couldn't bleed you or we couldn't create pus, then we had to evacuate you one way or another, either pumping the stomach or cause you to have emesis or enemas. And enemas took on great importance when we look at Louis XIV, and he literally took these in court, and hundreds of enemas given to the royalty during that period of time as part of their illumination of education. If you were wealthy, you had someone who would give you your enema at night. And so you had an enema bell, which on the back has a couple of clysters, one of which I brought today if you have time afterwards. So you'd ring the bell and a servant would come and administer your enema. These were enema buttons from the period of Louis XIV, done in silver at bedtime, and then another painting on ivory showing an enema administered by someone's chambermaid. Now, if you could afford nothing and you had to self-administer an enema, this one was filled up, in which case the enema plunger would raise up and then you simply sat on it and it would self-inject. So we do a little better these days. Stopping bleeding, Ambrose Paré developed the ligature for blood vessels in the 16th century, but it didn't catch on because they broke down. So what we used broke down and the bleeding recurred. It was called late hemorrhage. So the cautery iron persisted. Well, two inconveniences generally attend the use of cautery, forcing us to neglect it. First, the patient is usually wonderfully terrified of it, and second, mankind generally looks upon it as barbaric to advise it. And this is from an 18th century text. Later, we used gut, which we soaked in carbolic acid so it lasted a little longer, and in our career, still using chromic catgut, although synthetics have come back later. And then silver wire. And silver wire was an epiphany because for the first time, we had a monofilament that did not wick bacteria from one surface to another. So by using silver wire, you did take something from outside the body to inside the body, and you were able to do repairs you hadn't been able to do before. Transfusion came late. Of course, we didn't know about blood types, so we had problems with that, but the idea was there. The science wasn't, but the idea was there. Neurosurgery was probably some of the earliest surgeries. Someone gets a clunk on the head, gets a depressed skull fracture, and you have to relieve the blood pressure below it, beneath it, hematoma. So these various devices, and I brought one with me today in case someone has a bad headache and we need to do something about it. They look like a drill brace, again, drilling holes and releasing, evacuating the hematoma. Abdominal surgery was a problem because as soon as you got into the abdomen and you didn't wash your hands, you had peritonitis, the patient died. You weren't sterilizing anything, you weren't washing your hands, you went from patient to patient, taking advantage of the morning light. But the first successful abdominal surgery was a gynecologic surgery. It was an ovariotomy where they took out an ovarian cyst. I think, my God, it's huge, but it surely was benign. You don't get a cancer that big. The beauty of this, though, is it is not inside the peritoneal cavity. When the cyst is that big, you can enter it without getting into the abdomen, drain it, and evacuate it. And he was successful. And that began an era of all kinds of experimentation. And these are instruments used solely to remove ovaries, but notice the cautery iron, not suture, used to stop the bleeding. They didn't close the abdomen, but instead put metal plates because the suture didn't last and the clamps weren't good. So they had to observe for a few days to make sure hemorrhage didn't occur. Tongue depressors, things to illuminate the throat so that you could take care of whatever it was in a tonsil, an abscess, what have you. Every body cavity was in jeopardy. You couldn't do an operation, but you could work within the mouth. You could work within the ear or within the vagina or within the rectum because you could have drainage. You just couldn't get into the abdomen or the chest cavity. Excising the tonsil with a knife and later with a guillotine. Some were automated, and I brought one of these along too, just in case. And then, of course, bleeding was stopped, not with electric cautery, but just simply pressure. I mentioned that it's nice to not have your patient moving, and anesthesia was an enormous advent to finally be able to take your time and not have to operate with great speed because amputations require just that. And later, an ambu bag with a pig cecum and using chloroform or ether, but being able to monitor the amount. And these were safe anesthetics, except that they were flammable, and that had a problem in and of its own. A surgeon's lamp, if you didn't have sunlight, and a chair where you could position an individual for surgery in a way that you could get decent exposure. And this is actually a salesman's model, so it could be taken around and purchased late 18th century. A general operating set that has every imaginable instrument used by a railroad surgeon at the Grand Trunk Railroad, which later became the Canadian Pacific. He fled the United States during the Civil War to operate in Canada. Instruments made of ivory and given as a prize to a good student. Civil War USA Medical Department set, mostly around amputation, and probably the rarest set in my collection is this one, a Confederate States Army set. The Confederacy did not have an instrument manufacturer, so what they got was from London, usually, the UK, and they gave cotton in exchange for surgical instruments. Removing bullets from bone and from body orifices or wherever you had to probe deeply and extract the bullet, again, a frequent occurrence. And when all else failed, an amputation, if you couldn't stop the bleeding or there was so much damage. And I brought the saw on the top, which is a 16th century saw, but a beautiful animal head carved into the top, and then one lower with an eagle head also in ivory. There was this idea that orthopedic surgery was kind of like carpentry, and if you could fix bone with pins and wire, you could do so. And they were successful as long as they didn't have infection, but this later became commonplace. Curing hernia by simply pushing it in and scarifying the hernia sac by moving that needle back and forth. And then, of course, for every gynecologist, the central instrument, all the women close their eyes, the vaginal speculum, and a candlelight to illuminate the vagina because it's difficult to see. The earliest one I have is a 16th century one. I brought one of these to show as well. Probably one of the centerpieces of my collection. One to look at fistulas opening between the vagina and bladder and fix it. Made of horn and sometimes wood so that you could use cautery irons without burning the side of the vagina. And then entire sets of instruments used to cure venereal diseases. And Reichert is the one who separated syphilis and gonorrhea. And this is his own personal set of instruments, which I was just lucky to acquire, and then a gift given to him to his student. Removing the cervix in the case of cervical cancers was done with a very elegant instrument by Colombot, which I'm going to have, for the sake of time, kind of skip past. Again, all cautery instruments. But then we get to the men. And bladder stones had to be one of the most painful things imaginable. And that bladder stone you see above that instrument is about the size of a walnut. But this instrument had to be inserted through the penile urethra. You had to grasp the stone, and then once you got tight around it, you gave a sharp rap with a hammer to the end of the stone to crush it, and then extract it. So I say, it had to be painful to monitor that we lost our first guy. One using a drill, and then one to go through the perineum, and this will be used in women or men to be able to remove bladder stones. Antisepsis, washing our hands, the laudable pus. We sprayed acid, carbolic acid. Lister invented this, Listerine, Lister, sprayed carbolic acid over the wound to kill bacteria. But when you're operating, what would happen? You were irritating your hands. So what did you need? Gloves for his assistance. And all of a sudden, infection plummeted. And we look at the advance of hand washing compared to sterilization. Hand washing alone made surgical disease or infection plummet much, much more than antibiotics ever did. Antibiotics were a little tweak. Hand washing and sterilization was much more important. X-ray was nice to be able to see where the eye couldn't see. And this was Rochen's first image of his wife's hand. The X-ray tubes, however, fired in all directions, and they fired for a long time. And so the person using the X-ray machine oftentimes got all kinds of burns and so forth, because the exposure sometimes lasted for many, many minutes. Vaccination, you mentioned spreading the word that vaccination is a good idea. Well, the use of cowpox and vaccination in the late 18th century was an epiphany and caught on quickly because smallpox was a devastating disease and highly contagious. Crude drugs for the students of pharmacy. And I was missing, of course, one. What would be the drug that would be missing? What would be the herb missing? The marijuana. The Cannabis indica was missing. But I knew that I had the box, and I knew that one day my children would supply me. So when my wife was doing the laundry and said, "Look what I found," I said, "Finally." Because you can't be a physician in Ohio and go out and buy marijuana. Right? Apothecary chest, not used by doctors, but in wealthy households that had all kinds of crazy concoctions. Homeopathic drugs, where the pills are the size of the head of a pin, not to cure the disease, but to create the same symptom, helping you not have nausea by creating nausea. And of course, patent medicines, of which there were over 1 million at the turn of the 19th century, were crazy. And they're all cure this, cure that, cure cancer, ointments. But my favorite, and the one every student sees, is Dr. Bandit's warranted crotch pop. Will prove serviceable for all kinds of ailments. Other uses for crotch powder is for men's corns, tooth rot, foot blisters, genital itching, for women's private irritations, facial cream, after bath powder. Generally effective for ingrown toenails and snake bite. Also makes a fine laundry soap and fertilizer. Medicines tasted terrible. So the Gibson spoon was a way that you could fill it, put your thumb over the end with the opening, put it in the child or adult's mouth, and then let it go, and down the gullet it went. Inhalers of every kind were used for respiratory disease. Tuberculosis, we treated by inhaling vaporized iodine. Quack medicine, Perkins tractors, the first quack device, 2 pieces of dissimilar metal, just put between 2 points to produce some gradient, which miraculously would cure. These were sold by the thousands, and he became very wealthy, and of course they did absolutely nothing. And this is a snuff box showing the application in the late 18th century. Electricity, everything we could do with it. This was an 18th century electrostatic generator where we would go ahead and deliver electric impulses to every part of the body to cure things. And these were the devices to roll up and down the back, to put on the hair, a point cautery. And of course, from ear to ear, to just take the electricity and put it straight through from one ear to the other, through the brain. For mental disorders. Oxydonors that you put in the water and supposedly gave the person oxygen, these were sold in the hundreds of thousands. What are we doing today? And of course, the vibratory preventative, which when put in water, and this shows a couple getting married, put in water and then used as a vaginal douche would kill the sperm. But when not used for that purpose, if worn by the woman, would cause incredible enjoyment during the act of coitus. And of course, I could be handing you a line. And if I was handing you a line, I'd be doing what? I'd be blowing smoke. And where do you blow smoke? You blow it into the rectum. And this is an 18th century device with leather tubing, enema nozzles in the upper left-hand corner, a tobacco receiver on the right. And what was it used for? To revive the nearly drowned in Amsterdam and along the Thames in London. But it was also used for the induction of labor. Why did it work? Because of nicotine. And the rectal mucosa absorbed it very quickly. So at the end of the day, I think Isaac Newton sums it up well. If I have seen farther, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. And then Howard Atwood Kelly, gynecologist out of Hopkins, along with Williams. No group should ever neglect to honor the forebears upon whom their contributions are based. Great is the loss to anyone who neglects to study the lives of those he follows. And for that, I thank you for your kind attention and allowing me to share a passion of mine. Thank you very much.
I have something to present to you. Made by the Village Network, and in appreciation for your taking the time today to talk with us. And with the Rotary seal on one side and 4-way test on the other. Thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I love it. Certainly love them. It's perfect.
And with that, we stand adjourned.